Thank you, Aubrey. And we have an amazing group of panelists and a really tight amount of time. So I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on introductions, but I will ask everyone, building on how Aubrey started the day with a grounding in who we all are and who our identities are shaped by as a part of our families. I did ask all of our panelists when they first speak to just orient us to their own roles as parents, because every single person on this panel is a parent, and we wanted to ground some of the concepts that we're talking about with harms of removal, and especially building on the other panels today, harms of removal today, recognizing that as much as we've talked about things that have happened in the past, and as much as we've talked about things that are aspirational for the future, there's a lot of harm and there's a lot of removal that's still happening today, every day. And so we wanted to ground that in part of the conversation. I promise we will leave with some ideas and optimism, but I just ask that all of our panelists do a quick introduction of themselves, and also as a part of that, just identify who you are a parent for. I will follow my own lead on that and say, I'm Prudence, I'm from the ABA. I have 3 kids. I kissed all of them on their heads this morning before I came up from DC, 13, 11, and 7. And I will pass it to Iesha to do a quick introduction of herself.
Hi, I'm Iesha. I'm a mom of 4, 3 boys, 1 girl. A 13-year-old, 11, 9, and 6. And I love them dearly.
Thank you, Nena.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nena Villamar, and I'm the Chief of the Parental Defense Division at the Office of the Public Defender. I'm also a mother of 2 human beings and 2 dogs, 2 canines. My daughter is 18 years old, and she's in her 2nd year of college, and I miss her every day because she went 6 hours away. And I have a 13-year-old son as well, and I'm happy to be here with all of you today.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tania Caballero. I'm a pediatrician and parent. I live and work here in Baltimore City at Johns Hopkins. I'm a parent of an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old.
We'll share. Yeah. Hi, I'm Jane Spinak. Recently retired from teaching, and I have a daughter who's 34. And I would say that the birth of my daughter was the greatest influence in my understanding my clients who were children and my clients who were parents.
As I was introducing myself, my apologies. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rafael Lopez. I'm the Secretary of Human Services for the state of Maryland. I am the father of 2 children, Mateo, who is 15, and Adan, who is 17.
I'm Vicki Schultz. I'm Executive Director of Maryland Legal Aid, and I raised 3 children and have 3 stepchildren, and I'm also a bubby. I have some grandkids too. So my youngest is 28.
Thank you. And the reason, in large part, why we wanted to emphasize that is because, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Okay. For those of you online, it was a big thud. The reason that we wanted to start there is to emphasize that when we're talking about the harms of removal, and we've heard from that perspective of the harms of removal for a child, but there is tremendous harm for the parent. And I think we have heard a lot this morning that helps orient that, but I just wanted everyone to be grounded in their own personal space in that role, given the panel that we have today in thinking about that. And we're going to start with a question about sort of that concept of harm of removal and how we think about it in different social services delivery ways and in different legal contexts and kind of how it's evolving. So over the last 10 years, social science, law, and policy have started to reflect and acknowledge on the harms of removal experienced by children, by parents, and by families across a variety of sectors. And starting with you, Iesha, to ground us in today's conversation, what would you like people to know about the harms that legal systems can inflict on parents and their relationships with their children?
Well, from my experience, my kids were taken in 2021. right after my mom passed away. Once I was placed in that predicament, I lost the train of what actually was a parent role was, because I thought that I was doing it right. It put me in a mental jail. It put me through a series of depressions. Like, I couldn't understand why or what I was doing wrong, but in their case, my kids were still being homes and abused in their care. So I was into, I want to say trapped. So it caused a lot of mental stress on the parent because you can't get nothing done. I'm a musician at that too, so I was worrying about my career at that time. I had just signed up for The Voice, and I couldn't even pursue that because of the situation at hand, off of accusations. Like, it wasn't a thorough investigation done. My story wasn't told. It was like I couldn't say nothing. I didn't have no control over the situation, and I felt like I should have because I was the mom. And only the mom, I felt like me, like only I could protect them. My past made me like that. I've been in the same predicament with my mom. My mom went through the same thing. At the age of 2, I was in a group home. I was on the news. They found me on North Avenue. So it's like, even in their care, it's not safe. It's not safe for the parents, no support, it's nothing. And there was no guidance for me to figure out how I could go through it. I was homeless. I had my grandmother at that too. So I was calling CPS to try to get help. I didn't get help from them, but as soon as someone lied, I got that. I got my kids taken away without me even knowing. So, but like, it's just I feel like it's there to torment us in a sense, a way, and bullying, because it was like I was degraded. I didn't feel as what they would say as the norm. The norm was following the rules by the book. Everybody is not the same. So everybody's child is not the same. You can't teach everyone the same. Every household is not, every culture is different. We're not going to have the same idea. We're not going to have the same traits. But I've just felt like I didn't even matter. It was like, it was all about with the kids, but what about me? Like, I'm a victim too of this, because I was basically, this could have put me in jail. I'm been over the internet because of this. So it's like, what did I do wrong to be in this? And I felt like it was my color. I felt like it was maybe or the situation at hand. Maybe because I was homeless, they felt like I was unfit. Because I didn't have a roof over the top of my head, I couldn't teach my kids. I couldn't feed my kids. So it was like, what about the foundations before us? What did they do? Like, I grew up where houses, we was together. So if someone was homeless, the other one took that one in. And we figure out from there. But I was doing that, but guess it was wrong in the eyes of society. So I feel like it's a mental state. It sets the parents in a mental state of being trapped, and this is ongoing. It's never, because every move you make, it's like, I don't want to get my kids taken away. I don't want this, I can't do this. You're constantly, it's on your back of eggshells with the whole situation. I don't want that ever to happen again. And I don't wish that on nobody. I wish it was more of a support system than it did more than a take, because it don't help nothing at all.
And 2 pieces, Iesha, that I just want to go into a little bit more depth before we move to you, Nena, is one, I think you just said it, but I want to make sure everyone kind of heard that you had reached out to seek help from CPS.
Family preservation.
At one
I remember, I had a fire around 2015. And I remember family preservation coming in with Red Cross, and family preservation helped me get my birth certificate. It was this one lady, I'm not gonna say everybody, but it was some people in the system that would help. And I was always looking for this one worker, and her name was Miss Mayo. And she helped me get my kid's birth certificate. She helped me with a lot of stuff. And I just knew I was going to the right place because I had help before, but I didn't. It was like, okay, we really can't help you. I'm like, we don't help with that department. It didn't even give me resources. So 2 weeks later, next thing you know, I got that phone call from a sister of mine and saying that my kids was taken away.
And I wanted to follow up on one more piece, which is just to make sure everybody knows a little bit about kind of what your situation is today, where you have been able to reunify.
Yes, I have.
And so if you can tell us a little bit about your kids.
Yes, well, I was unified with 3 of my children when I raised 4. And I raised 4. One of my children is with their father that the system placed them with. And every day I think about him. I think about, he's my first. So of course the first one, it's your first love. That's your first child. That's your first step of being a parent. That was your first teaching of being a parent. So it's like, and he was my biggest help. Like every day I wake up, he right there. You need anything? And I feel like the state did that. The state tore my family apart. I feel like not only they did it to me, they did it to my mom. I feel like it's no support system in the communities because the communities will still put you down. It's no support system nowhere. So it's like, I can't just say just the system because it starts with everybody and I feel like we all won. And if I come to you for help, you shouldn't look down on me. If I come to a school, any facility for help, you shouldn't turn down or look down on me. I'm coming to you for assistance. And I feel like it's not enough. It's for not just the Black communities. I feel as though for all.
Thank you, Iesha. Nena, in your role as a parent defender, I'm curious if you can give us a little bit of your perspective about that sort of trauma that you have seen from the concept of the harm that comes from removal itself.
So I've represented parents in every stage of the child welfare proceeding in Maryland. And I've been doing this for 23 years. And I could talk for hours about what we know about the harms that come to children and that befalls children from being separated from their families. We know that they do worse in school, they face more health issues, they suffer from depression and anxiety. There's a foster care to prison pipeline that we speak of. They just don't do well. And I could talk for hours about that, but the point that I wanted to get across during my time, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the pain and the grief that parents experience when this happens to them. I think that a lot of people in the system, and when I say system, I'm speaking specifically about the court system, they tend to forget about that part. They tend to think that that's not something that should be considered, but it is a very real impact. Parents are like you and me. They're not different. They experience the same grief and the same pain that you or I would experience if our children were forcibly removed from us by strangers and placed with strangers. And if we were not able to call them whenever we wanted, to visit them whenever we wanted, or know that they could call us if they wanted. Like I said, my daughter is a sophomore in college. When she went away to college, I was a hot mess for the first 2 or 3 months. It's a little bit better this year, but we have the ability to talk to each other whenever we want. I know where she is. I know what her environment is like, and it wasn't a forcible separation. It's for a happy occasion, right? But what The clients that we see, the parents that we see experiencing is not like that. It is not a happy occasion for them. And what happens is their grief turns into resentment. The resentment towards the system that has made this happen to them, resentment towards the people who are carrying out this separation. And then that resentment turns into distrust. And it turns into distrust of the systems that are supposed to be in place to help them. But when you don't trust the system that's supposed to help you because it's not helping you in many instances, those systems fall apart and they cannot function ideally the way they should function. And ideally, they should be there to help families through difficult times. But when there's a lack of trust, there's a breakdown in the way the system is supposed to work. And when systems that are in our community, even the ones that are supposed to help us, when those don't function properly, our communities don't function properly. So it's not just the one family that is experiencing harm from that separation, because in the long term, it's our entire community that suffers. So that's what I see. That is the trauma that results from the forcible separation of children from their parents that we see day in and day out.
And Vicki, I want to pass it to you to talk from the perspective of child representation, kind of what you and members of your team have seen from that parallel.
Absolutely. So I think Nena alluded to the harm that occurs just from separation, from that removal, from that moment of removal. And we at Maryland Legal Aid are actually the largest provider of child's counsel in the state. So we represent children in the SINA proceedings. When children come for our representation, there's already been removal. So that has already occurred. Our lawyers enter the system at shelter, at that moment of shelter. What happens next for that child? And what I would say, to add to the pain that parents feel, there's also, what happens to the children? So the children in that moment often have no idea what's happening in their lives. They don't know why are they being removed from their parents. The folks involved in the system say little to them often. They feel not at liberty. The system itself is really part of a legal system, and our legal system is an adversarial system. So we have a range of lawyers representing different perspectives, and as we know, the legal system is designed that way so that from all these different perspectives, the truth will emerge. But in a family context, that can be very challenging. And for children, our lawyers show up at that moment when the child has already been removed, and they play an important role. I think I would say at that point, their role is as much to mitigate the harms as much as possible once a child comes into state's care and they're considering what next for this child. So child's counsel actually act as a voice for children. And it's an important role. That can be the first time that somebody's talking to the child, directly to the child, asking the child what happened, what's going on, trying to inform them about the process and what's going to happen as much as they can tell them, and also find out from that child, what is it the child wants? Our role as child's counsel is to represent what the child wants. And that's an important piece of this equation. The child may very fervently want to get back to mom and dad. And that voice has to come into the room. It has to be in the proceeding, you have to have considered judgment. A child has to be able to basically understand the consequences of a decision, what's going on. And so there's a sense the child has to be found to have considered judgment. And when they have been found, and it can be, even young children can have considered judgment, which is the standard, to be able to express their wishes and their needs. If they do not have considered judgment, it's still up to child's counsel. They then use a best interest standard, but they also have to bring to the court's attention what the child wants, even if they don't have considered judgment. That's part of the representation. So again, children are in these spaces They don't know what's happening. It's very confusing, very traumatic, and they need someone that they can talk to. And that's often the case, that it's child's counsel at that moment who's going to be able to present that voice and bring that in. But what we see is then the harms that ensue. So children in care of the state suffer enormous harms. And it's really a variety of situations that occur. One, they have the immediate trauma of removal, but then the placements themselves, as we know, are highly problematic. I think we all know there are a number of placements, very inappropriate placements that are being used by the state. Right now, we have children we know in hospitals, overstays. That's been an issue for quite some time. There's litigation around that. We also know children have been placed in hotels, and sometimes we have teenagers. We represent teenagers, and they actually don't want to be in a family setting, and they like being in a hotel. The problem is there's not supervision, and those children, that becomes really a problem because it becomes a pipeline to prison often. Those children, being teenagers, they may get into trouble. They don't have oversight. They don't have supervision or support. Sometimes they don't have the educational supports they need, and they wind up in a carceral setting. So that's also, it moves from one state system to another state system. That's one of the residual harms that we see that we're very concerned about. We're also concerned about medication, psychotropic medications that are given to children often, without an indication that they need that, without a diagnosis. I think the estimation was 72% of children in foster care are receiving psychotropic drugs, but they do not have a documented psychiatric diagnosis. And so using medicine in that way is also a harm for children. And we're very concerned about that. So that, and the other concern we have is for those children who do need supports, who do need that kind of care, those wraparound services, the ability to heal, to be able to get the supports they need. We're also concerned about that. There's great variation throughout the system. We've had some terrible abuse cases, some situations where children really do need protection, and we need to be there for those children. But it's precisely at those moments when children need more care, not less, more support, not less. They need therapy. They need to be able to have their issues explored. They need to be able to get the assistance and the help that they need so they can heal and be reunited. We completely agree that that is the goal of the system. But once the system cranks into motion, that can be lost. And that consideration of that harm of removal is another thing that we think needs greater exploration within the system itself. And we're concerned about that. So I think all of those things for us, it's a challenging system. It's a broken system in many ways. And I see our advocates see great variations from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and not in a good way, that can cause confusion as well. What happens in Prince George's County may be very different from Baltimore City, which may be very different from what's happening on the Eastern Shore. And that kind of inconsistency is also can be very harmful for children too, very confusing, and doesn't create the kind of consistency and support that we think children need. So those are just some of the areas of harm that we see in our practice on a regular basis.
Great. Thank you so much, Vicki and Nena. And I want to highlight a couple of themes quickly before we continue. One is the juxtaposition, right, of looking at harms of removal from the parent perspective and the child perspective is very deliberate. Recognizing, in large part, we've talked about history today, that this concept of removal and placement into foster care, for all of the attention that we put on evidence-based practices and require sort of high standards of evidence before we make decisions in a federal policy space or even at a state level, there was no evidence-based practice historically that said foster care and removal into placements outside of your home was a good thing. There's no evidence that that was a good thing. And we have lots of evidence, statistics, experience, and lived experience that it is harmful. And so I just want to sort of grapple with that a little bit before we transition into the second part of the conversation, and I'll pass it in just a moment to Rafael and to Tanya, but I wanted also to, I know Iesha, you had a thought on some of what Vicki was just sharing.
I feel as though proper investigation should be done.
Hold the mic.
Hello, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good. So I feel as though like a thorough investigation should be done to give that authority if a child should be removed. Now, if you got the physical evidence that a child, because I watch on the internet, a child was found in a trash. So it's like, even though CPS had the child at first, they wound up giving it back to the parent because it still wasn't, y'all seen that it was an issue there. You didn't go and do a thorough investigation. You didn't hear the child cry because the child was crying. The child was saying this, they didn't hear the child cry. So I feel as though even with my case wasn't done with a thorough investigation. It just assumed and we take it. But with that child being dead, it's like a lot of stuff they ignore. It's like the system ignore a lot of stuff. They ignore what really I feel as though they waste time on small stuff and ignore the big stuff. So it's like it's like it's okay, we just want to let them figure out on their own and we're going to just place them back out. No, you have to literally take the time out. After you place the child, you have to watch, especially like that, watch the family. See if that's the case. Don't just take the child away. See what's going on, monitor the family, and then make your decision like that. Don't just assume, oh, within a couple of days that this family is not healthy for the child. I feel as though that they really need to take their time because it's a waste of time and waste of money. And waste of energy for real, because you're hurting not just the parents, you're hurting the child. You're taking the child away from a lot, even though I do get it. A lot of children, some children are in desperate need of help, but do a proper investigation. That's the only way a lot of stuff will change.
Thank you. One of the pieces that we wanted to cover in the presentation, in the panel today, and realizing that we do have some time constraints on the back end, is a recognition that this whole focus on harm of removal, and as Shanta referenced, right, there's new state legislation developing around recognizing from either a judicial standpoint or the removal and the investigation, recognizing and balancing the harms of removal with what the safety assessment is, what the protective factors are that exist in that family. And I'm curious, Rafael, from your perspective, having been in many different arenas of government over these past several years, what sort of have you seen evolve, both in terms of sort of public attention on that, on the harm of removal, and what's being done kind of in a government sense to address that?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to join the panel. A couple of thoughts as I'm listening to my colleagues on the panel. Someone the other day said, well, why would you go to a panel that people are going to say that you represent the government and the government's been responsible for these things? And I said, because I'm not afraid to speak truth about government's involvement. And part of that is around, I'll never forget the first time I was on land in Indian country where I saw a boarding school, an Indian boarding school. And when you think about the history of removals in this country, they're highly racialized and highly genderized and driven by class. One can only look at the front pages of the New York Times, in early 20th century, when European immigrants, Italians and Polish, were literally lifted up from their communities in New York City and shipped across the country. What we could read a book called The Orphan Train. So what I have learned in my career in these multiple government functions is that we have a deep history in this country of removal. And so I think that when we take up these roles in government, we have to do the best we can to ethically respond to our families in a very different way. And so when you ask us to introduce ourselves as parents, there isn't a decision I make every day that I don't think I would not do that and would not accept that for my child. So I want to be really clear on this panel. A hospital or a hotel is not a placement for children in Maryland. It absolutely is not. And we have allowed that to happen. So I want to be clear. No one singular person, we. And so what we have inherited in this administration is years of decisions and lack of decisions across the spectrum and across sectors that I see echoed at all levels of government. So number one, we spend more time on the crisis and we spend more money on the crisis than we do on the front end. So the literature and the science tells us, in particular, when we invest early and often in children, particularly the 0 to 5 years of age, it's a time in a human being's life where we have the most development in human brain. So if we invest in that time in supporting a family when they need help and structuring our systems to say, how might we help you? And do that, we would actually save the government far more money. Now that said, let us be clear, and I have no problem saying this, which is that there's an entire machine of contractors and folks all around us at all levels of government that help keep this running. Now, I'm not ascribing ill intent or bad will or that they don't come from a good place, but there are choices, whether it's in Maryland or the nation has to make about where you put your money. So for example, when I think about the work that we did in the Obama administration to change Title IV-E of the Social Security Act, for the first time in the nation's history, to allow for the child welfare system to use federal funds to invest in prevention. What were those kinds of things? Around things like mental health issues, so that a child isn't placed into care without a proper diagnosis. Why wouldn't we spend more time investing on the front end on prevention than spending more money? But the federal government, the very office for which I was responsible, will reimburse states like Maryland, the new office for which I'm responsible, when the crisis has happened. It makes no sense to me. That's why as a governmental official, I can say, it makes no sense. Why don't we spend enough on parent representation? It's very, very difficult. So bottom line, I've seen this at multiple levels of government. We need to make sure that we're investing early and often so that we don't have a situation that we're repeating and removing children, causing harm to the family, and most importantly, tearing families apart.
Thank you. I'm really happy that we have a pediatrician on this panel, because one of the things that I think we can all relate to as parents too is that there are a lot of times when you need a pediatrician in raising kids. And so Tania, I'm curious from your vantage point, sort of what you've seen. I'm going to have a two-part question for you to combine some of what we've talked about, but what you've seen in terms of that emphasis on harm of removal that came from pediatrics, right? So much of the challenge against family separations that were happening at the border a number of years ago, really it came from research and understanding from the medical professionals about that bond between a child and a parent. But I'm also curious from your vantage point as an ongoing practicing pediatrician about some of what Nena was talking about that trust in sort of relationship, and what Iesha was talking about in terms of like where people can go and seek help and trusting, advice and guidance while raising kids, and kind of what your role has been as a pediatrician in that space.
Sure, I'll try to be brief, but I will say that the most I've learned in my training was when I became a parent. And really, parents are the experts in their own kids, and I always tell them that. I can talk to you about diseases or prevention and medical things, but really trusting parents in what they think is best for their kids is extremely important to an extremely important mindset as a pediatrician, but also important to be very clear about with parents. And I can't say that that's true for all medical professionals. But I think that goes to some of this, a little bit to the solutions part. We really need to train people about intrinsic bias, about in an anti-racist, curriculum, when working with parents and families from different cultures and different backgrounds. I think that will really help medical professionals better be able to partner in a very honest and open way with families in order to really be supportive in all different kinds of settings when all different things are happening, whether it's from prevention to, a medical issue or crisis or whatever it might be. I think that's extremely important. So, I may be the expert in some things, but in so many other ways, particularly in parenting, the parents are the experts. We're just here to support. I'd say what was really interesting, it's a light way to say it, with family separation that was very public in like 2017, 2018 with family separation at the border is, all of the harm that we've been talking about, the trauma, all these things that we've mentioned have been happening for generations and generations. This was a time where it was extremely public, and there was a lot of imagery and a lot of testimony about what people saw in these detention centers and what people were seeing in images all over the news. And also the fact that these families came to seek refuge in our country, and they were faced with law enforcement. Those were the first people who they encountered. Law enforcement officials do not want to deal with kids, right? That's not their job. And so then kids and families come into systems where who they're encountering are not people who are really meant to deal with children. And so these kids and families were faced with, separation without any due process, without any evidence that anything was going on with the parents, that there was any evidence of harm, no trials. Kids were just removed as part of the processing, of immigrants across the border. And these are kids and families who've traveled thousands of miles, hundreds of miles, through horrible conditions. And then the first thing that happens to them is they're separated from the caregiver who's nurtured them and cared for them this entire way. So I think that in that particular case, it was difficult to ignore, for the public, not among people who do this work, who have lived experience, who care about this work, like the people who are here today, but many other people in the country who are on the sort of, and the divide about immigration were forced to see these kinds of images. So you have this sort of combination during that time where you have the data, which is, toxic stress and harm around, when you separate kids from families, from the caregiver, they experience stress. That chronic stress can lead to chronic medical problems, mental health problems, asthma, other medical problems, substance use down the line. So you have that evidence. You have images that you can't ignore, people who have testified, and then people who testified. So you have images running across the news about kids in cages, about kids, infants and toddlers all in a room alone without any other parental supervision. And then you have this testimony in Congress about people who have gone into the facilities and said, I've seen this, I've witnessed this, and me as a medical professional, this is unacceptable. And so you have this, we all know these things have been occurring for a long time, but in the sort of political strategy of immigration, all of these things came to a head at once. And I think that it brought a lot of these issues to light. They were fundamentally about kids being separated from families, and everything that has been already mentioned, that's true for any child. That the trauma with a parent, the stress of the child, that it doesn't matter who you are, what background you come from. If you separate somebody's caregiver from them, those things are going to keep happening. And I think that it did shed light on this issue, and I think that helps us think about bringing more people to the table about what the solutions are in other sectors. But I think it's sort of one example of how maybe this issue was brought into the public for people who otherwise have the privilege of not having to pay attention or not having to see that this is happening. So I think that was a very interesting, important issue.
Thank you so much. And to round us out, and I think it's appropriate because I think she launched some of the convening yesterday, but Jane, my question for you is, looking at, right, we've talked about the pediatric perspective, we've talked about the agency sort of delivery of services perspective, we've talked about children's counsel, parents counsel, the direct perspective of being a parent going through this. There is a very large legal component to all of this. And so I'm curious, Jane, especially given some of your recent work, what are your thoughts about the role that the courts and the legal system plays in both maybe causing some of these additional harms, and what is, on a more optimistic note, what are some of the ways that the courts can play a role in the future, if at all? I know some of your work challenges that, but if at all, in mitigating this issue.
Well, I wrote a whole book that that says courts can't do this, and we should instead support communities to be able to take care of their own children. I thought, as part of my answer, I would reflect on some of what got said today, because it shows both what the problem is, but also how we ignore the problem of family separation. And since I'm supposed to talk about the court's role, I'm going to start with what Angela said about CAPTA, which is that it's a prosecution. So we've been talking about prevention. But when a family, when parents get taken into court, they're prosecuted and they feel like they're prosecuted. But they're prosecuted often without lawyers, often without evidence, often without actually the judge enforcing what the law requires. So in New York, it's imminent risk. I know it's not imminent risk in all states, but if the court were really upholding the standard of, is this child at imminent risk, many, and require evidence of that, actual evidence, not somebody's idea, I think that would certainly decrease the number of removals. But I'm also thinking about both what you said about parent representation and you said about child representation, because I have done both. And I'm thinking about how this all happens in a moment of crisis. I can tell you my clients did not trust me in that moment of crisis, whether they were parents or whether they were children or youth, because why would they? They don't know me. They don't know that I can help them. They don't trust the system and I'm part of the system. So one aspect of the harm court does is it expects the lawyers who are representing the clients in those moments to do so with almost no time, no preparation, no capacity to engage with their clients in ways that are meaningful. So we hope they trust us in those moments, but I don't think they do. Over time, they may. Over time, if they're fortunate to work in a family defense practice where there is a lawyer and a social worker and a parent advocate, that doesn't happen in most of the country. Fortunately, in New York, it does. But if they had that ability, then maybe a parent advocate could say, you can trust this lawyer, or you can trust that this social worker is not going to report on what you're saying, because so let me sit with you while you talk with them. Okay, that costs a lot of money that instead we're spending on removing children. But there's a whole process that should go on even before you walk into the courtroom that does not go on. I also was thinking about Alan and Vicki talking about best interests of the child as a standard that is used. And it makes me think back to the books that Goldstein, Freud, and Solnit wrote about removals of children. And in their second book, they said, best interest of the child is not the standard. It's the least detrimental alternative, because the best interest of the child has already been destroyed by taking the child from the family, even a family that has many challenges and can, and maybe at a moment in time is unable to care for that child. But let's not pretend that best interest of the child is a standard. it's the least detrimental alternative. And several of the people in the red table talk, you know, put real people into those situations and said, yeah, nothing was best about what happened. The other thing that I wanted to go back to is how much today has been talked about prevention. And we all talk about prevention, but as the commissioner said, we don't spend the money on prevention. In 2019, of the $34 billion spent by state, local, and federal systems, 14% of that was in prevention. And we don't even know what constitutes prevention. So for me, so much of this is about non-intervention by systems and being able to use our resources for communities so that they themselves can figure out with their families, with their neighbors, with the larger community, how do we support all families so that they never reach this, what we're talking about today, which is the harm of removal.
And I think, because I know I have two panelists
Yes,
who have to
sorry.
go right at 3:30. Am I right? Okay, so I wanted to let you guys, I know you have to go, but I wanted to circle back for the remaining to make sure that Iesha has the last word, because it ties in, Jane, with what you just said in two different ways. One is, I think when we talk about prevention and coming from the family perspective, I want us to remind ourselves of what Iesha said, which is that she called CPS for help because she had known someone from back when she was a child who had been helpful. And she thought there was help available, and it was not. And the second thing I want to highlight and give her the mic is to say, Iesha, who was the one person you trusted and you felt like you could count on?
Christina, my parent advocate.
Your parent advocate. And I don't know if Christina Simmons is in here. Oh,
My parent.
when she said
Everything.
Christina, I thought of Christina Simmons too, because I was like, the parent advocate role.
As my parent advocate, when I first, Maryland didn't have no parent advocates at the time. And then so happened I was blessed with one. And when I tell you, I was so used to doing all the work for us, my kids, schooling, for us, the doctor's appointment, she felt that in. I didn't have to call down to school because Christina was on the phone. I'm rolling them. Like, she was the person I could call at night, text at night, anytime at night to talk me through everything. She will put the fight in for me. And you know why? Because she could relate it to what I went through. The only people that can help you is people that can relate and not look down on you, even down to talking to my attorney, because I did not. And that's no disrespect. It was like, I did not like my attorney because she looked down on me. It was like, only person and then every time I was on the phone with my attorney, I had her on the phone. So, or she would three-way me, like, I'm about to call happen. So anytime I had a problem, she addressed it. I didn't have to really say nothing. I was blessed with Christina. Like, I'm grateful for you.
Thank you, panelists. I think some people are able to talk afterward, but I do want to thank you for landing us there. And thank you, everyone, for being
with that. Parent advocate is a big help to the parents. For real, it really is. That will be help.
That. Yeah. Well, I think there's a. No. Prudence, is it okay if I
Go
respond?
for it, yeah,
For the- to
yeah.
time? What I have found, and for those with whom I've worked in different roles, when you take on some of these roles, you end up spending your time on the brokenness and the fires. And the one thing I would say, specifically about how we see people, tied to my friend here, is that if we look only at her or my or your brokenness, we'll never fix the system. We have to see beauty and brilliance and power and potential in her as a parent and in everybody. And that means holding ourselves accountable for the decisions that are made in elections and in budgets. And that's not just because of where I am now. I've seen it across, and that kind of advocacy demanding that kind of change. So I want to give you an example very quickly about the issue of something that my colleague said about the number of kids in hospital overstays and in hotel placements. I am 8 months into this role and have inherited an enormous mess. I'm not afraid of that mess. I'm not afraid to take it on. And that means speaking truth and joining me in my outrage about what I've found. Because I, as a secretary, can't do it by myself. It's going to take a whole lot of people reimagining how Maryland must demand a different way of doing business. And that means voting, it means including, it means advocating in Annapolis with everybody. I have no problem saying that because it's true. It's hard and it will take time. But we have to reprioritize what we've grown to accept as normal in Maryland. It is not normal in Maryland to have disproportionately Black children removed from their families. That's not normal. It shouldn't be normal. We have all come to accept that. It's also a trend nationally. This state ages out more young people disproportionately than the nation does. Why? We don't have to do that. What if we were the first state in the nation to not age out a single child? So the way in which we're approaching this work is we're going to take on some tough elephants in the room. People will get upset. We're not going to shy or back down from that. So the address, right? It starts with our own addresses in this state and in our nation. What are we doing to take up our leadership to activate and to demand a different kind of way? Because the system that we should have is not one that has thousands of children being cared for by governments, when the literature tells us that governments aren't good at raising children. Families are, by blood or by choice. And how we find them and how we do it differently is, I think, the next generation of this work.
Can I just take 1 minute, and I won't be offended if Rafael and Vicki have to leave while I'm
I feel
speaking.
badly because I feel like I don't.
No, it's okay, really.
We
I-
have a meeting about one of these issues.
Yes. No,
I kid you not. I kid you not. And actually, I'm going to say it. It's around how do we as a state serve our LGBTQ+ students and young people in this state to make sure they receive the right kind of supports that, as we often know, are sometimes different, and they need a different kind of attention. And so we're trying to think this through differently in Maryland. And that's what I'm going to go do right now. So thank you all.
Right.
Right.
I just wanted to end my contribution here by telling you about something that we are doing, and we're not waiting until tomorrow. We started last Monday. The Public Defender's Office has launched a program called the Better Together Early Family Advocacy Program. And it is a program that we mustered up funds to begin. We only have a little bit of money, but by God, we've launched it. And the goal of this program is to get involved with families before a removal takes place, before a Senate petition is filed. And we will provide them with a defense team composed of an attorney, a social worker, and a parent advocate. And our goal is to prevent family separation and do what agencies are supposed to do, which is to give families what they need. If it's food, if it's money to get their electricity back on, if it's water, if it's a referral to substance use disorder treatment, we will help them with that. So we can start today. We do not need to wait till tomorrow. And we hope that we can get your support in getting this program up and running well.
Thank you, Nena. Yeah, I will close it out by just saying thank you to our panelists for being here, for being a part of the change, and for calling us all to be a part of the change that we're being asked to follow. So thank you.
I swear I will be quick. I have a paragraph of a speech and then a bunch of notes written because there was a lot said today. And And I just wanted to say that today was actually a dream come true for me. I have very morbid dreams. But, you know, this paper that I wrote a long time ago, the thought that like people would come into a room from all over the country to have conversations about how we could be doing things better and to name the harm of removal and to share the harms that they experienced and to have people come in who have been thinking about this for so long to brainstorm with us together about how we can do all of this better is really just remarkable to me. And thanks. I know there's a lot of people online. Thanks. You know, I also want to thank Angela for sort of bringing us back to our conversation from last year surrounding family integrity. Because, you know, when people ask me what family integrity is, I usually say it's whatever you want, right? It's your right to be the family that you want to be without the government telling you that that's not the right way to be a family, right? And as Angela put it, the way to keep families together is to just not tear them apart. You know, it's not rocket science. And I'm really sitting with Corey, I'm gonna get this wrong. Corey saying that collectively we have a proclivity to draw from memory, not history. And I hope that we sit with our history for a little bit and don't forget that. I think I'm gonna put it on a bumper sticker. And I just want to say thank you, you know, to our panelists and our moderators for being here and all of you for engaging in this important conversation. And particularly to our panelists who have been most impacted by these systems to come up here and you know, share parts of their story and to share what they've learned. And I hope that you all learn from them and from everyone else who shared their expertise. And I'm really here to say that, you know, we're at the end of the day. It's been a long day. It's been a heavy day. But, you know, Aubrey started by saying like, this is the beginning of a conversation. And we hope that you stay in touch with us and with each other so we can work together to reduce family separation and the trauma that accompanies it. And I really want us to think, you know, for those of us who work in legal and social systems, how can we use our power? You know, how can we use our privilege? How can you as a lawyer or social worker reduce harm? And I think, you know, Jane did it in her book and she did it again here, Alan. We all sort of have to sit with the harm that we caused, you know, and in teaching students, you know, I reflect on my moments as a young attorney and where I caused harm. I thought I was a parent's attorney. I was trying to keep the kids home. I was doing the Lord's work. And I think of so many moments now where I think I caused harm. And don't get me wrong, I was pretty good. But there are moments where I know I caused harm, you know, and I sit with that and I think about it often. I really think about it in my teaching because I think owning up and saying, hey, we all make mistakes and this is how we're going to move forward. And you don't have to be one thing forever. You don't have to be your mistake. We are all learning all the time. We were talking about how like things I wrote 2 years ago, I would probably write differently today because I've learned a lot in 2 years. I learned a lot today. And I think for a lot of us, the first step is listening and coming together and making space for those who have been affected most and understanding that education can mean a lot of different things. This is where all the little notes start. I know, okay, yeah, making space for people, as Christina said, you know, communities know what they need. We don't have to tell them. We just have to listen and try to do what they ask us to do. It's not rocket science. And I know that we're not all in a position to make laws. We're not all litigating. We can't all write books, although a lot of people in this room have written books. We aren't all social workers, but each of us can do something to prevent the harms, right? Everyone can do a little bit. Right, Christina? Everyone can do a little bit. So I don't know what that looks like for you. Can you help to build a community that you want to see, that you want to raise your kids in? Can you babysit for someone who needs childcare? Can you walk that kid to the bus? Can you get a coat for the kid on your block who needs one? Can you, like Michael said, can you bring the box with the grapes, with the can of grapes? Can of grape juice? Is that what he said? You know, the can with the grapes. Do you really need to report? Could you just fix the problem that you were going to report? You know, it really stuck with me, and I hope it stuck with you. How many of our panelists said that they had their first child taken from them and their parents had their first child taken from them? I can't even say that without, you know, to think of that happening is too much, and to watch it happen over and over. We cannot continue to accept that. That is not right. And we cannot continue to accept a system that does not deliver on its promises. How can we sit here and call it a system of child protection when we all agree that the system causes harm? I hope that the conversations that we had today stick with you. I hope you think of them often in your own lives and practice. And I hope you continue to have them with us and with everyone else. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for doing this very intense and important work. And thank you for being a part of our community. The world we hope to see is possible. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I am going to put up a QR code that is going to ask you to fill out an evaluation. I told you that I used to be a social worker and I left some data. Last year, I think we had like 4 people fill out the evaluation. So if you could help me in my, you know, like help me put that on my, like, look at the good things I did in the first 6 months. She got more evaluations. If you wouldn't mind doing that, that would make things really great for me. You can use your smartphones, the picture. Look, oh, I see you all. Thanks for helping me out. And if you don't need to fill it out, if you're like, I got to get out of here, you can always just have you can even take a picture of it and then do it later too, if you have to scoot out fast. But thank you all for your time. We will be back next year. And we hope to be in touch with you as you decide what change you want to make after today's conversation.